void video to keep the user occupied long enough for the attack to run. And it would inject a script tag into the HTML, where they would source in the malicious JavaScript they needed to propagate the worm. From there, they were somewhat stuck because the actual subdomain they were on, and again, I'm faking the subdomains here, the actual subdomain they were on didn't have access to all the information they needed to propagate the worm. They needed your friends list, and the friends list was over on a different subdomain, and they needed a token in order to be able to send the message. And that token you would get from an API on a different subdomain. So just because they got into one subdomain, they still need to go and get information from other subdomains to actually propagate this worm. And fortunately for the attackers, RenRen had an AJAX proxy set up where all of those subdomains were linked. So what they were able to do is they were able to leverage that AJAX permissioning system to get the read access into the other subdomains, to get the friends list that they needed from the friends API, to get the token they needed from the token issuing system, and that allowed them to propagate the worm. And so sometimes with sometimes with cross-domain permissions, you need to be careful because website developers will go and they'll separate their content on a bunch of different subdomains. And they'll go, okay, my content's protected because I've separated it out in different subdomains, and the same origin policy says that different subdomains can't talk to each other. But if you're designing your website and then you go back and you add a bunch of cross-domain links, then essentially what you've effectively done is you've rejoined all those subdomains again. So you may actually be undermining some of what you intended to do by separating things out onto different subdomains by using cross-domain permissions to link them all back together again. So it's something to think about when you're architecting your website, and you want to be very specific about how you provide those cross-domain permissions. And if you look at the specs for the different cross-domain permissions, the different technologies all provide a level of granularity. In Flash content, you can be as specific. You can provide cross-domain permissions all the way down to a specific directory on your website. With some of the the new AJAX XHR2, you can do it on a per-page basis. So you want to, when you're picking your cross-domain choices and how you're going to link things together, you want to always be as specific as possible when linking these sites together. In RenRen's case, they were using the document.location trick, and that's essentially this equivalent to doing star.google.com or star.youtube.com. So. And you need to be careful of not getting lulled into certain ideas because as soon as I'm able to get into the DOM of the web page that has the cross-domain permission, when I send a request, the referrer for my request is going to come from that domain. It's not going to, in the examples I've shown, if it's evil.org, that's not actually going to show up as a request from evil.org because evil.org is now operating under the security context of that victim site. So if you're relying on something like refer in order to make sure that the requests all come from the correct website as a cross-site request forgery protection, that's not necessarily going to help you in these situations. So it's something you need to be careful of and watch out for. And I think as we move together to more of a mashup world and with widgets and gadgets, people are going to be linking these domains more and more frequently. And developers need to make sure that they focus on using specific controls, that they use the formal controls, not use the older, less formal controls, and take into consideration what they're doing. So with that, I'm now going to pass over to Jesse, and Jesse's going to talk about some of the shared risks that are among plugins. So that if you're a webmaster who's got a website that has all these mashups and you've got all these different plugins, what are the common things you need to know that apply to all plugins in the event that you're not a security expert on each individual technology?
Thanks, boss.
There you go.
Got it? All right. Thanks. So once again, I'm Jesse. I'm on the Silverlight team. In the picture Peleus showed earlier, I was the blue halo guy, so you know. So yeah, as he mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about what the shared risks are here. So and kind of the way I've been thinking about this is that as more and more technologies get turned on in the web, the more important it's going to be to focus on the things that are common to all those technologies. And as Peleus mentioned, the same origin policy is a huge part of that. And a lot of what we're going to talk about here is going to be basically common to all these different technologies. I also want to point out that the ren worm and the other, so the ren worm that Peleus pointed out, there's nothing specifically Flash about that. It wasn't a Flash platform issue. The problem was the way the DOM access was granted to that RIA, right? The same thing could have happened with Silverlight, and I believe probably with Java as well. Just want to point that out. So the first thing I want everyone to keep in mind who's planning to develop RIAs or is doing it right now is that there are really no secrets here. It's really not that much different from HTML and JavaScript where everything's in plain text. A lot of people don't realize this at first because the applications that get delivered to the client are all kind of zipped and jumbly, and it's not really obvious what they are. But under the covers, they're really not that complicated. So for Silverlight specifically, it's really just a zip file with managed DLLs inside of it. So if someone wants to see what's in there, they can easily unzip it. They can easily run .NET Reflector on all those DLLs. So what does this mean? Well, probably shouldn't embed secrets, keys, passwords, other things like that. Just treat it as plain text. These can be decompiled. Don't hide anything in there that you don't want people to see. There are different kinds of obfuscation tools that you could run on these things. You can use them if you want. Just know that you're setting up speed bumps. You're not adding locks, right? You're really just making it a little harder to get at the data. But essentially, you'd be playing a cat and mouse game. And if it's data you really need to keep secret, you should assume that someone's eventually going to find out about that. A great example, Peleus showed me. This is a video. I think it's on hp.com. You can search for it and find it pretty easily. This is Billy Hoffman, security researcher. He noticed one day that, I guess, a local restaurant in his area had kind of an online game promotional thing they were doing. And the way this game works is that you play the game, and you accumulate, a certain number of points throughout the game. And depending on how well you do, you get sort of a free prize at this restaurant. You might get a cheeseburger or fries or whatever it might be. So, hacker that he was, he sat down and he thought he might be able to get some free food out of it. So he started looking at the data traveling on the wire as he played this game, and he realized that no data was really coming out of the app until the game was over, and then some kind of encrypted payload was going to the server. And he tried replaying the payload a little bit. It didn't seem to really do much good, but so then he thought, well, why don't we just kind of decompile this thing and see what's going on? And once he did that, it was very clear that they were just sort of hashing username with date with the prize that the player won. So once he found that out, it was pretty easy to just write his own app and spoof that request back to the server. And he did this a bunch of times, and he got a bunch of cheeseburgers. So there's that. And he did tell the restaurant about it when he was full, we're told. That's how the story goes anyway. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about loading dynamic content. And this gets a little, I'm going to be a little vague on purpose because this can mean different things depending on the RIA. So let's just talk a little bit about this. Most client-side technologies allow for some loading of dynamic stuff. In the web world, this is basically loading, different kinds of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You can load stuff on the fly if you want to. This is kind of, imagine the AJAX stuff, right? You grab some HTML content from the server that you need to display in some way. And as we all know, that kind of introduced some JavaScript injection, cross-site scripting problems on the web. So the key thing to remember here is that, make sure the content you're loading, that you know whether or not you should trust it and that you're treating it the right way. Another thing to think about here is that loading content from another domain can also be another form of cross-domain communication, like Peleus was mentioning earlier. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So specifically, in a Flash, a Swift, a Flash app, can load another Swift inside of it. And by default, things are kind of locked down, but there's certainly controls there to open that up, and you need to be careful about that. In Silverlight, an app can load XAML or DLLs dynamically. You want to be careful when you do that. So I think this really just comes down to knowing the threat model, though. You should have your DFD. You should know where your data is coming from, know what APIs they're flowing to, and make sure you look up the documentation for those APIs and see if they're really meant to be designed to handle untrusted data. So now I want